Hello everybody, this is Gold Mage Ace, Eric, talking Gaming Rant number 1 on Age of Empires 2. So I've come across the not so newfound knowledge that I'm quite addicted to a game my friends and I play all the dang time when we're bored. It's called Age of Empires 2, the old sequel to the original Age of Empires game for the PC. And I've come to the conclusion that I am honestly completely hooked to it. Hilarious as the statement may sound, I'm telling you right now that I'm completely serious when I say it. I'm about as hooked onto it as a fish would be on a triple-sided lion baited with the best thing a fish had ever tasted times 1,000. But I'm not here to praise a game that's already received enough praise to last it a decade. I'm here to poke some serious credit at a game that has some flaws I'd like to point out. Not because I suddenly hate the game like the zombie survival guide's line on how swords should be used, but rather about how I think the mechanisms could have been tweaked to make the game a little bit better. Correct me if I'm wrong first off, because I've gotten tons of reviews for RTS, and a lot of people seem to think that Age of Empires 2 is one of the greatest RTS games they've ever played, and possibly better than the next gen AoE 3. I feel the reason for this is a combination of simple game mechanics and the fact that not every unit is a projectile that can kill you in a few shots. To be honest, the mechanics of flying units are so bogus that you might as well scrap ground infantry altogether in most games, just so you can have a wide arena of flying units patrolling until they're shot down by anti-air cannons that take forever to build in the first place. And sea warfare is practically the same thing in most RTS games. Make 100 billion boats and you've won, because the enemy will never reach you, and the time you decide to attack, the enemy can't do squat about it. Age of Empires 2 is a great game for the sheer fact that it tested the limits of a player's ability to micromanage resource gatherers in tandem with deciding the right time to attack or defend. The better map centered around one or two choke points, which is the equivalent to the syringe tool in Trauma Center. If you have control over the syringe, your patient stays alive, i.e. you're winning. If you don't have control of the patient's dying, you're not in control of the game and the opponent is beating you. Professional strategies usually consist of a slow early game comprised of churning out enough slaves to get to the next stage, at which point you'll inevitably need to make more, build buildings you may not need, and then advance to the next stage where you'll do the same thing over and over until you finally reach the Imperial Age, also known as the press your kill button before the opponent does age. Pro strategies usually involve having a 75% population of villagers, with the remaining 25% being a military that will slowly wean away opposing forces and villagers. Killing enemy villagers is the best possible strategy since they can rebuild anything you destroy, and if an enemy has 1,000,000 of them, you can't research spies to see the entire freaking map. Pros typically have 150 villagers, 50 military, and it's comprised of part siege and part ranged units with a great amount of sight and attack power to F over your enemy's villagers and castles. Other pros sometimes weave around advancing as fast as they possibly can to have a more decisive military earlier, and beat the enemy before they can so much as plead the First Amendment in RTS gameplay. In short, this tactic is advancing as soon as you have the buildings and resources, and it reminds me a bit of a typical theory of evolution. You grow up faster so you can kick the other kid around who's busy developing the right way. In essence, you're growing up fast enough to smother your enemy, who's still learning how to walk and can't really defend himself. These feudal rushes, however, are entirely offset by turtle pros who build walls so early it becomes pointless to waste resources on man-at-arms. You can't even break down walls made of straw, much less heavy stone. Infantry are at a large disadvantage in this game because everything and its debilitated second cousin could beat infantry when shoved en masse. Upgraded infantry beat regular infantry. Cavalry can health rape infantry to death and have more armor. Archers can rape infantry at a distance, and particularly because infantry have no pierce armor to back up their massive shields, and siege units like the Scorpion mow down cavalry, so it's no big surprise that infantry would be no problem. In the end, I view anything besides the Teutonic Knight a complete waste of time and attention, and even the Teutonic Knights are difficult to use correctly because they're snail slow and are just infantry with a lot of attack power. If you remember Nemesis from Resident Evil, it's the equivalent to the Teutonic Knight without the ranged attack power. This was a bit displeasing because the maps are so large that churning out infantry becomes pointless, and I thought infantry were the most prevalent unit in medieval society. Hand-to-hand combat was a must, but Age of Kings makes it look like infantry should have just never been considered a military unit. 30 archers could beat 30 infantry if given the time of day because they get shots off before infantry have time to think about which freaking archer to attack. And by the time they know which one to attack, half of them are taking a dirt nap. One would think cavalry is an acceptable alternative, but the problem with cavalry is that they're twice as expensive to make than your typical infantry unit. And when there's not unlimited gold on the map, making that many cavalry is about as tough as clicking the damn wood button on the market faster than your opponent in the hopes that carpal tunnel syndrome doesn't set in before you have enough gold to make more. In the end, you might be making an army worthy of a real crusade, but pit against a formidable swarm of archers and a castle, you might as well have spent money on spending more money. The cost of upgrading a mere knight into a paladin is painstaking enough, when the civilization's unique unit might be a better investment. Ha! Veterans of Age of Empires will know the joke when they hear it. The civilizations are a bit lopsided when it comes to unique units. Their own specific civ upgrades aren't so lopsided, but the military unique units have clear advantages and disadvantages that can't be ignored. I usually pick British because I like watching my opponents struggle with the fact that everything dies due to a rain of arrows coming from 180 degrees of sheer darkness. It's not normal when a castle can't retaliate against 40 or so bowmen because they're too far away. That's about as stupid as someone working at Subway telling me I can't have chicken with my teriyaki chicken sandwich. Castles should be able to retaliate against anything except for trebuchets, but no, they can't retaliate against foot bowmen. As a result, my enemies attempt to toss out dozens of skirmishers in the hopes that the old good versus archers clause is going to save them. But the weak health of the skirmishers combined with relatively no pierce armor, weaker attack, blindness compared to the British, and the overall cheapness of the units makes for a relatively easy victory for the bowmen with the badass lines of sight. In the end, my comrades in arms have trouble deciding which civilization would be best to beat the British, but ultimately end up scratching their heads over the difficulty of beating the 6+5 impeccable range. No other real unit has such a range, and most other civs require close quarters combat before they can be considered effective. And if my opponents somehow get past the British rain of arrows, they have to deal with the scorpion stream of inexcusably powerful, fiery area of effect attacks, which I've also dubbed the ballista bolts of hell. It appears to most opponents that the only way to beat these bowmen is to catch me as a human being completely off guard with an unorthodox tactic, or to tire out my economy by making me rush in with other units. Other variations include the completely valid but slightly assy trebuchet rush, in which my enemies decide to demolish as many buildings as they can with these slingshots of certain doom. My experience playing Persians as a civilization was made much less invigorating when my war elephants took 4.5 hours to reach my enemy's slingshots and another half hour to catch up when they were packed and rolled away from my line of sight. War elephants are great units, but only good if your enemy has no choice but to mobilize infantry and weak archers. They're an effective way to tell your opponent you have tons of resources and that their buildings might as well be made out of Care Bears. In short, however, the better player will always come out with a slight advantage, seeing as how the better player almost always knows how to mass-produce millions of tiny slave workers to do his or her bidding, while they build walls upon walls upon walls and await siege with open arms. The veteran player of Age of Kings will know how to micromanage villagers with a psychotic amount of attention while also defending his city with the precision of a brown recluse spider. The Age of Kings veteran will also know the specific names of technologies to get, hotkeys to press for buildings, advanced commands, and ratios for villagers to specific resources. Even if the opponent understands that the sheer villager number equals more resources, the veteran will scoff at this opponent than when they show up with their first military. They laugh even harder when it's mowed down by wave after wave of random units with seemingly no end in sight. Professional players couldn't care less about what unit they're mass producing because in the end they can pay for more and much more easily than the opponent, who's forced to be innovative or else pay the ultimate price. It's at that point where the player with more knowledge throws a curveball courtesy of a monk army and randomly converts a watchtower while all the other monks heal the first one like a dictatorship. Suddenly, holding the choke point becomes more important than making sure the farms at home base are still being worked on, and now the economy looks worse than me at 12:56 a.m. What's more frustrating is trying to explain the game to a newcomer who wants to get good fast, because you know they're not going to know the difference between selecting and commanding, and you almost want to thrust the game down their throat in the hopes they'll digest it and breathe it. You start slow by saying that the villagers need to gather resources, and already it goes to hell. They need to be told what resources they'll need for what, and then what buildings build what, and what units do what, and pretty soon you're an instructions manual instead of a strategic advisor. Newcomers to Age of Kings play through a few games to understand the concept of right-left clicking, resources, villagers, and respective units. Then we'll talk about tightening a few screws and emulating your score. I guess the final thing I want to say about the game is that it's great, and you should buy it if you're an RTS player with the love for medieval warfare. If you're not, then you should probably buy something else with that money, like a Subway sandwich or college tuition.